Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Parvaneetha from the Lex Aquatica Committee, which is a student-led initiative aimed at disseminating information and stimulating discussions on international and domestic laws related to the marine environment. It is fueled by none other than you on Click, the runner-up of the 7th Annual Millennium Oceans Prize. As part of Lex Aquatica initiative, one of the events we are organizing is the Malaysian Marine Environment Public Policy and Law Review Competition, MPPLC. Today's session would be included in a series of discussions with experts to provide further background information to key issues and a brief overview to the topics we have set out for the participants. We hope these discussions will aid participants in finalizing their policy and law reviews. In that context, I will be the moderator for today's session on the topic of sustainable fisheries. Now, it is time to welcome our speaker for today, Ms. Chitra Devi Balakrishnan. She is the Footprint Manager for WWF Malaysia Marine Program and an expert in sustainable fisheries. On this very fine day, Ms. Chitra Devi will be presenting on the very topic sustainable fisheries. How are you doing today, Ms. Chitra?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me here, Farah, and and the Lex Aquatica team as well.
We're very happy that you're fine, and without wasting any time, I think we should just get started off with your presentation. So the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just quickly share my screen. Great. All right. So thank you so much, everyone. And so we're here today to talk about what sustainable fisheries would look like for Malaysia. So I just want to set the scene for us and what's happening currently with fisheries here in Malaysia. And so my first slide itself is a bit of a shock statement in the sense that between 1970 and 2010, you can see that we've actually lost anything between 85 to 95% of our fish stocks. So if you look at the map here, you can see that in 1970s, most of our fishing areas were still quite green, which is reminiscent of a very healthy stock. But then in 2010, we can actually see that most, or if not all, of our fishing areas is already in the red, which is obviously an indication of overfishing. And if you were to look at the reason for this, it's very simply the demand for fish and the demand for seafood, specifically from Malaysians. Malaysians eat on average about 57 kilograms per capita every year. And we're like top 5 in the world with regards to how much seafood that we eat. And if you look at this chart, which very, very clearly shows you how the increasing trend in consumption, which is the red line, actually correlates very clearly with the decreasing trend in fish stocks, which is the blue line. And this essentially is the driver for overfishing in Malaysian waters, our demand for seafood, right? And in 2018, we produced about 1.8 million metric tons of seafood, and agriculture contributed about 22%, which means that almost all of our seafood is still coming from the wild. And 1/3 of our animal protein for Malaysians are still derived from seafood. So you can actually see that seafood is actually a food security element for Malaysians. We still rely heavily on seafood, and it will actually affect our food security if we cannot sustain the amount of production that we need to be able to meet this requirements for protein. And this essentially is what we need to talk about today in terms of how do we mitigate this, how do we manage this overfishing. And the problem is that this is not just in Malaysia, this is a global scenario. So again, the Food and Agriculture Association, organization in 2018, states that almost 67 to 70% of our fish stocks are already at the level of being overexploited or collapsed, or even fully exploited, which means that essentially we have only about 15 to 16% of our fish stocks that's actually available for expansion globally for increasing population, increasing demand for seafood. So essentially the question is, how do we meet this demand if our fish stocks are doing so poorly? And on top of this, there is this ever increasing fishing effort. So when we say fishing effort, it encapsulates two elements: the number of fishermen out in the oceans and the number of fishing vessels out in the ocean. And over the years, we have actually seen an increase of fishing boats and fishermen in the oceans, trying to get as much fish as they could so that they could meet this growing demand. And here, this right now is where we need to really take stock of what needs to happen in order for us to address this problem, right? And so in 2021, or WWF Malaysia sat down and said, okay, we really need to look at this problem for Malaysia and really need to think about how do we address this problem. So we came up with a really ambitious goal on how do we tackle overfishing for Malaysia. So our goal is that by 2050, which is, if you think about it in the scheme of things, in the scale of fisheries in Malaysia, which started in the 50s, in the 1950s. So in 2050 is basically 100 years from when fisheries really started in our waters. In 2050, we want to actually be able to say that 100% of our marine fisheries and aquaculture are being sustainably managed. That's the aspiration for this country. And we want to see this happen. And of course, in order for us to meet that, national long-term aspiration, our 2030 aspiration, that is, we really want to see at least the coastal fisheries. When we say coastal fisheries, we are talking about areas that are within 30 nautical miles of our coastlines. And we want to say 100% of these coastal fisheries and aquaculture are again being sustainably managed in order for us to actually meet the 2050 goal. And so the justification for us when we set this 2030 goal is because the coastal fisheries are the one that's most overfished. So if you remember my earlier chart that I had showed you the maps, you can actually see that the areas closest to our coastlines were the ones that first became red and yellow, as opposed to the deeper sea fisheries. So these areas have got the most intense fishing pressures, has the most intense coastal development pressures, marine pollution, population, because most of our cities are scattered around our coastlines as well, and important marine habitats. So again, loss of degradation of habitats, fishing pressures, too much people, the pollution from industries and cities, all this has caused an excessive amount of depletion and decline within our coastal areas. And so that really is the focus for us, by 2030, that we need to address this. We must address this. Otherwise, it's really impossible for us to achieve, the aspiration we want for sustainable fisheries in Malaysia. And when we say sustainable, fisheries, essentially it's about, having a fishery that is ecological in terms of being maintained and restored its ecological parameters, benefiting the fishing communities as well as the societal resilience, and also having a very precautionary approach to its governance. So this, in essence, is what a sustainable fishery would look like. And so if we think about, moving forward, if we want to reach that 2030 goal for coastal fisheries and 2050 goal for all over marine fisheries in Malaysia, really what we need to think about is really supporting the small scale fisheries. As we know, a lot of the commercial fishing fleets have contributed to massive degradation of our fishing resources. So for example, if we were to take bottom trawling, it actually is a very untargeted fishing gear, and it catches a lot of juveniles of species, as well as endangered, threatened, protected species. We've seen many instances in especially newspapers of bottom trawls having dragged a whale shark, or having dragged in a marine mammal, say a dolphin or a dugong, or having dragged in a turtle. So these are really what some of our commercial fishing fleets do, because they're very untargeted, and especially with bottom trawls, and they actually also destroy what we call the benthic habitats, which is the sea floor, because they have metal structures that actually helps to scrape. So it's like sweeping through the floor, and they scrape up everything as they pass through the distance that they trawl in. So these are really unsustainable. So what we really need to focus on is really supporting the small scale fisheries, which are actually more sustainable. They use more sustainable gears, and they are, they have a certain range of fishing areas, and they also rely on fishing for their livelihoods. So this is the very essence of their livelihood. So they really feel that connection to nature and the connection to the marine ecosystem, and hence, they have a bigger stake in wanting to become sustainable. So that's one area that we really need to think about. The other area we need to think about is phasing out unsustainable fishing within our coastal areas as well. So again, looking at some of the more commercial fleets that are very, very unsustainable, and really thinking about how we can come up with, political as well as institutional framing and financial frameworks to actually be able to support such a phase out from our fishing industry. And then, of course, when we think about, how do we provide incentives for this fishing, for the fisheries to actually become more sustainable, is really bringing that market recognition for sustainable products. And how we do that is through transparency and traceability. So really providing that opportunity for digitization, which is right now, it's not there within our legal framework, within our fisheries management. There is no requirements for digitizing how we collect data on fisheries, so be it how we catch fish, who catches fish, where the fish is being caught. None of this information are in a digital space yet. Everything is still very, very manual. So we really need to think about digitizing our fisheries industry, including both the small scale as well as the more commercial fleets, to be able to provide that transparency and traceability for our fisheries, which will directly also support sustainability. And of course, finally, when we think about, once we have all these elements in place, then we can think about certification, providing that market access, that that financial access for fishing fleets to be able to do more and really become a lot more sustainable. So that's that's in a nutshell of where we are and where we need to go, and probably also how can we get there when it comes to transforming our fisheries from becoming to becoming more sustainable. So I'm just going to pause there for a while and see if there's any questions or any thoughts, from our moderator. But yeah, thank you so much.
No one would have thought, as in majority of us, eating fish or seafood is actually affecting the environment, And then I think we should just focus and step back, realize that what we are doing should be controlled and kind of help the environment in a way. So I think we have a few pre-prepared questions to be addressed today. So one of it would be on what you were talking just now about bottom trawling, right? So you say we have to avoid that because it's actually affecting the critical ecosystem. And we are also a recent article, I think it was published and it featured you. We were talking about how overfishing is actually affecting the resources as well. And what do you think, as for now, the governing law for fish for the marine environment, specifically for sustainable fisheries in the Peninsular Malaysia? So what do you think the improvement should be made to the Act itself so that there are more enforceable law and it is more effective in our time right now?
Right. Actually, I think that's a brilliant question. So I think one of the things, whenever we talk about fisheries, especially fisheries in Malaysia, and even within WWF, when we started working on sustainable fisheries programs, one of the biggest challenge for us is actually getting the science right. So there was really very, very poor research being done in the area of fisheries management, or even fisheries science for that matter. There was just too many gaps in how fishery science was being, studied or researched, so that it actually leads to poor fisheries management. Because in order for you to actually have effective policies, you need to have science, right? So because your policies needs to be science based, but then we really have this gap where institutions are not doing the science because other issues are a lot more attractive, are or are better funded than fishery science. So when we think about some of the policies that we have, for example, like the bottom trophies up in coastal zones in Peninsular Malaysia, right? That was a policy that was introduced, and then now there is an implementation where they've pushed back. So previously, bottom trawling started from the 5 nautical miles right up to 30 nautical miles, but now it's been pushed back further from 8. In some places it's 8 nautical miles, some places it's 12 nautical miles, right? And so what does this mean is that, really the question we need to ask is, what was the science behind this decision making, right? Because the science is really unclear. What was the benchmark that we set? How did we know that, pushing it back to 8 nautical miles or 12 nautical miles would actually be able to recover our fish stocks, considering that we've actually been, trawling this entire area, and it's probably been trawled so many times in the last 50, 60 years, because commercial fishing started in the 60s. So we've been trawling this area for a very, very, very long time. So how do we know that just shifting it back a bit would actually help fisheries recover? What's the science behind it, right? And another area that we also feel that fisheries management is not looking at is also the whole community and social issues around fisheries. So sometimes it feels that when we look at fisheries management, it is very one-dimensional or even two-dimensional. But in actual fact, fisheries is it's multi-dimensional. There are so many elements that that intersects and influences how fisheries is being implemented or even managed in a particular country. So again, these are some of those questions that we need to start asking. And I think that fisheries managers also need to start asking as well, do we have sufficient science? If we don't have sufficient science, can we get the science right before we put in the policies? So that I would think is one of those key message that we need to start thinking about is how do we make sure that we put in frameworks, either legal institutional frameworks that actually encourages science-based policies and science-based decision making within our ecosystem.
Yeah, I do really agree with that. As you were talking about the science-based decisions, there's always, as a law student, I would say there's a very distinct difference between science and law, and sometimes we kind of have struggle, kind of connecting both of it. And I would say for sustainable fisheries, there is always an overlapping of jurisdiction, like the power we give to the state level and also the federal level, and then they have their political issues in the environment, which shouldn't have been from the first place. And then with that, we are kind of in a place where it's all mixed up and we cannot like navigate our problem. And we're just from the first place where we started. So how do you think we should kind of have a distinct environment?
That's a very interesting question, Parwa, and I may not be able to answer that, but I'll just give you an example of how this intersection actually happens. So one of the first things I did when I joined WWF, and this was in 2010, was this report called the Fisheries and Poverty Report. So basically, we were trying to understand, what was the incidences of poverty amongst the fishing industry. And one of the facts that came out of this was the fact that the fishing communities, especially the small-scale traditional fishing communities, were actually the poorest of the poor. So we had like a list of all these, people in poverty in different industries, and you could see that the biggest percentage of them was within the fishing industry. And for us, that's really an element that has not been addressed. We keep seeing, different policies, different, national plans, development plans, talking about, raising the poor, out of this poverty bracket. But on the other hand, if we're not doing anything about the fish stocks and the overfishing situations and this commercial, commercial expansion of fisheries, how do we even address this, very basic question of poverty, right? So that's one. And then in the same report, what I also found out was that there was actually a very consistent correlation between election years and increase in fishing boats in our waters. And for me, that was, that was again another sign of how, politics really influences fishing, because for every politician, each fisherman is actually, a voter, right? So trying to support them, especially during the election years, by giving out, fishing gears and fishing boats is a way for them to actually secure that vote. But then at the end of the day, it's actually a vicious cycle, because what they're actually doing is they're increasing again capacity and and fishing efforts in our waters, and it's causing the fisherman who's actually relying on fisheries to actually just become poorer, because there's just less fish to catch. It's like there's one piece of the pie and everybody's racing for that pie. So yeah, so there's no answer, but I'm just sharing that there is this very strong correlation. Fisheries, unlike any other conservation work that we do in WWF, fisheries has been one of the most challenging, most struggling, topics, because of all these socio-economic, political, elements within this industry as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that answer, Ms. Chitra. I would totally agree with you on that. And I think one of the way, as you were presenting just now, you say that we should distribute and not just focus on the same area and have fisheries obtained from the same area, as it's just gonna deplete, and the fishermen are not gonna have much to do over there as well. And so let's maybe just turn the lens over to maybe international level. And from what I kind of like researched, I would say like Norway is has one of the highly structured administration, because they have like several departments, they have ministries. And when we go to the near country, Philippines, they also have one of the governing law, which is Fisheries Code of 1998. And they are actually doing well with what they are having, and they kind of know how to face the struggles. And what do you think Malaysia should take from them and any other countries, and apply that in our own legislations?
Yeah, totally. Great question. So I mean, just giving an example of not just Norway, but generally, a lot of more developed European countries, or closer to Asia Pacific, even countries like Australia, right? I think one of the important element that makes their fisheries more well managed is the fact that they give it a lot of importance and priority. So, like for example, they can say Norway. Everybody knows that Norway is a major seafood producer, right? Because they are huge when it comes to agriculture. Almost the bulk of the salmon that we consume all over the world is probably coming from Norway as well. So there is a lot of importance about fisheries within these nations, and more importantly, they allocate resources. So that means it's they have financial resources, they have human resources, they have sufficient manpower, they have the science, they have the technology. Everything is in place for them to actually govern their fisheries in a really well managed way. So it's talking about good governance as well, right? And good governance is a lot of things, not just about having the right kind of law, but it's also about having the people to implement the law. And sometimes that is one of the major struggles that we face, in terms of having sufficient capacity to be able to monitor, patrol our oceans. One of the other reasons, earlier we were talking about bottom trawl, right? So one of the other reasons why, again, bottom trawl is so destructive is because they actually contribute, they're not supposed to fishing. So previously, when they were within the 5 nautical mile range, they do what we call fishing at the line. So they used to weave in and out of that area, so that they could also fish into the traditional fishing zone area. So again, such act, and because we don't have sufficient capacity, insufficient boats, insufficient resources to even buy fuel. So these are some actual challenges that are faced by the Department of Fisheries. In being able to monitor, the ocean is huge, but the kind of allocations they get is so minimal, in order for them to actually be able to manage this sufficiently. So these are, again, essential elements that are missing, or that are not well catered for within our ecosystem. Now going back to Philippines, so I had the pleasure of being able to visit the Philippines and look at some of their fisheries management in the area. And one of the things that really impressed what they have, this system called the barangay system. So the barangay system is basically a legal provision for villages, in Philippines to actually be able to make rules actually governs their own fishing areas or their own resources all the way up to their central government. So it goes up to municipality. It's recognized at regional government and central government. So again, this is something that's missing in our ecosystem, because our fisheries is actually a very central management system. It's being managed by the federal government. We do have fisheries departments and offices in state level, but the fishing communities themselves do not actually have a lot of decision-making authority or participatory authority within this ecosystem, right? Within this legal ecosystem. The best example I could get is the Tagal system that is being applied in Borneo, where the local communities actually manage the freshwater fisheries in their riverine systems through putting in legal laws to be able to manage resources so that there's no overfishing, and everybody within that village adheres to these laws and rules. And that's something that I feel that that I've always felt is it's very, very useful and might actually be very effective in being able to manage overfishing at the coastal area as well.
Wow, that is something very, very new. And yeah, from what you said is that manpower and the way we think and how we should solve the problem is very, very important. Like we see Philippines, as what you say, they have this system, and maybe we could like learn from them and try to implement that in our own way, and maybe we could like save the environment. Our participants would be very much interested in researching about it, and I hope they would be able to come up with very great and comprehensive policies for the competition. So one last question before we end this Q&A session would be just to put it out there, what are the very crucial and main top listed issues on the challenges the fisheries and the marine environment in Malaysia faces, and what we should do, just the top listed issues, so that our participants, can know.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned earlier, the top one is always about building in science-based policies, right? So I would reiterate that is, again, one of the biggest challenge and one of the biggest need we have for how we manage fisheries in Malaysia. The next one, of course, is in order for us to actually look at policies that will manage our Malaysian fisheries towards becoming more sustainable, really need to look at political and legal and institutional frameworks that actually allows for fisheries recovery. Right now, we don't have those elements in our Fisheries Act, so really need to look at fisheries recoveries. Really need to look at how the ecosystem services that's provided by both fisheries but also by the oceans for fisheries are protected. So, for example, an upwelling site. So an upwelling site is basically an area where you have a lot of nutrients coming. It's a nutrient enriched area. So as I was saying, we need, in order for us to actually, have policies that manages our fisheries to becoming more sustainable, we really need to look at, policies and, institutional frameworks that actually supports fisheries recovery. Because right now, we're still looking at fisheries production. I think we need to start thinking about fisheries recovery if we really want to sustain this industry in the long term. Next, of course, is looking at ecosystem services and important habitats and protection of this habitats and services. As I was talking about, upwelling areas, which are very nutrition-rich areas, but we do not have information about where the sites are and whether activities like reclamation and coastal development, how much of these sites have actually been lost to us because of all these coastal activities, right? So that's another one. Another one is actually looking at policies to manage our fishing efforts. As you know, and I've been going on about fishing efforts. So when you think about fishing efforts, basically there are two ways that we manage this. So one is called an output control. So basically looking at, you know, how much fish we take out of the oceans. And the other one is input control, which is basically about how much fishermen and boats and gears, you know, and how big an area we allow for fisheries to happen. You know, so really, I think for Malaysia, we've been very much focused on the input control. So we have closed areas, you know, like our marine protected areas and our fisheries protected areas. We have licensing for vessels. We have licensing of fishermen. We have licensing for fishing gears, but we don't really look at output control rules. We don't really manage how much fish is being taken out of oceans and whether this level of removal is actually sustainable or not. So those kinds of rules, we need to start thinking about those rules. And of course, you know, really monitoring things like, you know, juvenile fishing as well. So we do remove a lot of juveniles from our ocean. So, you know, again, when we think about, you know, output control rules, then we can start thinking about, you know, how we fish and what we fish and how, you know, targeted we need to be when we fish. So again, these are all things that we need to start thinking. And finally, when we think about, you know, fisheries, is whether or not we have the right kind of, you know, ecosystem, the right kind of environment to support sustainability in terms of recognition, incentives, as well as also whether we are built to mitigate climate change impacts. Because, you know, right now we are not, and climate change is a real threat. And fisheries are some of the industries that's actually being, you know, badly impacted by climate change. So these are, again, you know, some of those elements we need to really think about when we think about sustainable fisheries management right up to 2050 and beyond.
Yeah, that was a very, very insightful and a very good answer. I think whatever you said, as a public, what we should do is be mindful of what we are eating, and I think it starts from there, and being considerate and having try to think back of what we're taking every day, and you know, kind of the public as we are trying to help and do what we can as best we can do. So thank you so much for the wonderful and insightful session for today, Ms. Chitra. We hope the participants would be as interested and very happy to, you know, learn from you and kind of implement everything what you said in their policies later. So any last words for participants?
Yeah, no, good luck to the participants. And, you know, this is very interesting. You know, I'll be really interested to see the kind of, you know, policies that comes out of this competition as well, and how we can, you know, together build a more sustainable, a more resilient fisheries for Malaysia and Malaysians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Chitra.